What is truth? With that question, Pilate relinquishes the opportunity to judge Jesus justly as he rationalizes his unwillingness to take a stand against the trumped-up charges presented by the Jews. Since that time, people have wrestled with understanding what truly constitutes truth. Most recently, the political turmoil of the U.S. has made this question the focal point of debate as various political parties have accused the opposition of presenting fake news or manufacturing truth to fit their worldview. In the years that followed the Renaissance, the question of who determines what is ultimately the truth is one that will challenge the church to its very core. The result will be a major division in Christianity with the development of modern liberal Christianity. The big debate among Christians during the Reformation was in response to the question, how is one saved? If you were committed to Roman Catholic theology, salvation was made possible through the sacraments. The church held the keys to the sacraments, determining who could receive them and who could not. Failure to keep in good graces with the church resulted in not having access to the sacraments needed for salvation. This theology was based upon a Roman Catholic interpretation of the scriptures going back to Augustine and Aquinas. The Reformers vigorously protested this perspective, returning to the teaching of Scripture to support their viewpoint. Salvation is possible through the grace of God by faith alone, they declared. Every believer had the opportunity to have direct access to God, to receive the grace of God. The Reformers continued to read and apply Scripture differently from their Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. Even though they disagree on interpretations, they did agree on one thing. The Scriptures were one of the key sources for understanding the truth about religion and nearly every other aspect of life as well. As we move into the age of reason revival, we will see that for many people, the big question will take a decided shift. Now the question becomes, what is the source of truth? In the age of reason, we see the beginnings of some major shifts that will have a significant impact upon the place that faith has in defining truth. Science and human reasoning begin to question the worldview of the religious establishment and its dependency upon the authority of Scripture. As a result, a radical shift takes place as Christian faith moves from being the foundation upon which society stands to now becoming more a matter of private opinion. This shift will take a few centuries before it reaches the level of secularism that we see in society today. Nevertheless, its seeds can be traced back to the period of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Enlightenment. The word Renaissance is of French origin, and it literally means rebirth. It's a period in history ranging from 1350 to around the mid-1600s. It represents a rebirth of learning, culture, and a resurgence of science. Several changes take place during the Renaissance that will contribute to the shift in authority from the church to science and human reasoning as being the highest authority. First of all, there's a shift in perspective on human beings. The Reformers were big into Augustine's view of human depravity. They saw the world as fallen and human beings as sinful creatures incapable of making any moral changes outside the grace of God. The perspective of Renaissance thinkers, however, was much more optimistic. Humans would be able to reason themselves out of the mess created by sin and eventually create a moral world. Second, the pent-up frustration over years of war in Europe related to perspectives on the Christian faith that left many people longing for a more tolerant approach. Certainly, there must be a better way for Roman Catholics, Calvinists, Lutherans, Anabaptists, and other Christian groups to peacefully coexist. In many ways, the religious infighting among Christians was one big factor leading many people to question the validity of the Christian faith as a moral leader in society. Scientific discoveries also challenged long-held religious teaching about the universe. Copernicus developed the heliocentric view. From his perspective, the Earth was no longer the center of the solar system, but the sun was. and this threatened widely held opinion in the church that God created the earth as the center of creation. This heliocentric view would continue to be supported by Kepler with his discovery of the influence of magnetism on planetary flight, and this suggests that planets orbit the sun, as well as by Galileo's invention of the telescope, providing the scientific data that's necessary that successfully demonstrates that the Earth was part of a planetary system. Later, Isaac Newton will come along and describe the world as a great big machine that operates on its own. And this opens the door for future philosophers to question whether there's even a need for God to sustain the creation and maintain its operations. In a new model of science, humans are displaced as the apex of creation, and since the world is a smooth-running machine, some begin to question whether God is even needed. The assumption of this age is that humans can find the truth through the use of their senses and reason. As scientific observation and reason raises questions related to long-held biblical teaching, the door starts to open with regards to questions as to the validity of that religious teaching. This shift from the church as being the authority in all matters to now science and human reasoning being looked to for explanations resulted in various responses from people both inside and outside of the church. Some tried to harmonize reason and faith. They discovered this by distinguishing between truth that's discovered through reason and truth discovered through faith. They attempted to alter the truth of religion by supplementing it with the truth of science. This attempted to make human reasoning be used as a means to explore the teaching of faith. One example of the use of reason that's used to explain faith is that of the French mathematician and Roman Catholic theologian Blaise Pascal. He uses reason to attempt to present an argument for believing in God. He says, "Belief is a wise wager. Granted that faith cannot be proved, what harm will come to you if you gamble on its truth, and it proves false? If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then without hesitation that he," referring to God, "exists." One might call this line of reasoning as the wager you just can't lose. While you can't prove faith, on the other hand, you will have left nothing to lose if you step out in faith. So it seems like the best bet is to believe in God. This argument by Pascal has been used in various forms since his time as an apologetic for inviting people to take the leap of faith in believing in God. Another argument used to support religious truth comes from John Locke. The English philosopher and physician widely regarded as one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers. He's commonly known as the father of liberalism. He will affirm that the existence of God is the most obvious truth that reason discovers. As Shelley notes, however, closer examination shows that the God Locke had in mind has little in common with the God of the Exodus or of Jesus' resurrection. Locke is not arguing that the revelation of Scripture reflects truth. Rather, he argues that revelation shows Christianity's reasonable character. Belief in Jesus as Messiah and man's ethical behavior are all Jesus and the apostles required for righteousness. Both of these are basically rational. The deist will be another group that represents a rationalistic approach to faith. Deism was popular in France and in England. Familiar names among the French deists include Voltaire, D'Alembert, and Diderot. English deists were Edward Hubert, David Hume, Charles Blount, John Toland, and Lord Shaftesbury. Several of the prominent leaders in the colonies after the American Revolution were deists, such as Ben Franklin and Tom Jefferson, Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. And deism is illustrated very clearly in the philosophy of Voltaire. One of the tenets of deism is reflected in the quote from Shelley on page 329. Most of the prominent infidels who ridiculed Christianity during the 18th century believed in a supreme being, but regarded it as superstitious to hold that he interfered with the world machine. For deists, Christianity was judged by the simple human standards of good and evil. They believed that God created everything and then simply allowed it to operate on his own. God created the machine and left the machine to run itself. They objected to the intolerance of Christianity. In fact, they thought that a lot of the good and evil that they find in the world was attributed to Christianity, and it was the product of revelation and centuries of Christian teaching. While deists dismissed the authority, tradition, miracles, and revelation of faith as failing the test of what can be verified and proved, they continued to want to enjoy the benefits from the moral values that came from the centuries of Christianity's influence upon society. We see the acceptance of the moral teaching of Jesus without the need to accept the full scriptural revelation of Jesus as a divine Son of God, which was characteristic of many of the deists in this statement made by Ben Franklin. Franklin states, "As to Jesus of Nazareth, I have some doubts as to his divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble. I see no harm, however, in its being believed, if that belief has the good consequence of making his doctrines more respected and better observed." The leaders who were part of the Orthodox Christian faith responded to deism in many different ways. The Roman Catholic Church had the response of using the authoritarian tactics of the past. They tried to censor the dangerous books presented or written by the deistic writers. Of course, this response did very little to counter the opinion that the Christian church was intolerant and sought to rule people through a priestly class. In England, several wrote effectively to counter the rationalism of deism. One person was Bishop Joseph Butler. He wrote a book, The Analogy of Religion, and he used the book to refute the rationalistic assumptions made by the deists. His arguments challenged the sovereignty of reason. He suggested that reason only offered probabilities and not absolutes. He went on to build his argument by stating that life is filled with lots of unexplained mysteries in nature. And these unexplained mysteries in nature, if they exist, one can assume that there would therefore be unexplained mysteries in religion as well. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude that there's an equal probability that faith is valid as there is that reason is valid. Whether you agree with his rationale or not, what is significant is the fact that those who spoke out on behalf of Christianity are now using human reasoning in making their arguments rather than simply using Scripture as the basis of their understanding of truth. The eventual rejection of deism, however, did not restore Christianity to a central place in Western culture. The influence of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis upon science and human reasoning, opened the door to a different way of viewing civilization. No longer would civilization be governed by religion. Instead, faith would become compartmentalized as humans made a deliberate attempt to develop a religiously neutral civilization. Interestingly, this would mean that faith would function in the private realms, confined to church, home, and heart, rather than in the public realm. And this is characteristic of modern secular societies today. The desire to create a religiously neutral civilization presents several challenges for modern society. For example, What then becomes the basis for which behavior is determined to be moral or acceptable, if it's not based upon the revelation of faith? What happens when society defines one standard for moral behavior that is directly at odds with the values of a person or a group's religious faith? As this video comes to its conclusion, take a few moments to go to your Bright Space classroom and respond to the following questions from your perspective and from your reading in Shelley. What problems does a religiously neutral society create? And how can the church most effectively respond to those problems?